Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Syakina binti Abdurrani. Today I represent about the difference of Malaysia foreign policy in the context of Dato Seri Najib Tun Razak and also Tun Mahathir Mohamad. Okay, for the abstract, the purpose of this research paper is to analyze and comprehend the fundamental elements and motives behind Malaysia's considerable adjustment in foreign policy throughout the 10 years of Dato Seri Najib and Tun Mahathir Mohamad. The research tries to uncover the sources of this development and examine their consequence for Malaysia's regional and global posture by evaluating both Prime Minister foreign policy decisions and actions. This research, via a comparative analysis, gives significant insight into Malaysia's developing international relations and makes recommendations for future foreign policy decisions. This study will add to the current literature in Malaysian foreign policy by giving a true examination of the key trends witnessed through the Najib and Mahathir administration. Okay, so for introduction, Malaysia's foreign policy is essential in determining its regional and global stature. The country's foreign policy orientation has shifted significantly through the years, notably under the administration of Dato Seri Najib and Tun Mahathir Mohamad. Understanding the origins and motivation underlying this shift is critical for understanding Malaysia's changing role in international affairs. Malaysia's foreign policy is an important component of its national strategy, affecting the country's connection with other countries as well as its position in the global era. Malaysia's foreign policy remains independent, principled and pragmatic with ideas of peace, compassion, justice and equality as its core. Malaysia's primary foreign policy goals has been to safeguard its territorial integrity and national objectives while also making major contribution to a fair and equal international society through effective diplomacy. Malaysia's government's foreign policy have had a considerable impact on the country's diplomatic goals, international engagement and response to numerous global concerns. Dato Seri Najib Tun Razak was Malaysia's Prime Minister from 2009 until 2018. Dato Seri Najib adopted a foreign policy that emphasized economic diplomacy and actively attempted to expand Malaysia's commercial connection with other countries throughout his term. His government priorities measures like the Look East policy or Dasar Pandang ke Timur, which intend to learn from Japan and South Korea's economic success. Dato Seri Najib also promote regional integration through venues such as Association of Southeast Asian Nations (ASEAN) and aggressively interact with global powers such as China. Malaysia's aim to attract international direct investment, strengthen trade links and diversify its economic alliance during his leadership. Meanwhile, in Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, he is Malaysia's Prime Minister for two non-consecutive terms, which is 1981 until 2003 and 2018 to 2020. On the other hand, adopted a foreign policy marked by aggressiveness and a focus on Malaysian national interests. Tun Dr. Mahathir prioritized the notion of Asia for ASEAN, aiming to increase regional self-sufficiency while decreasing dependency on other forces. He argued for a third world coalition to counteract the power of affluent nations and a more fair global order. Foreign policy under Tun Dr. Mahathir likewise emphasized the significance of sovereignty and non-interference in domestic matters, frequently criticizing Western operation in other nations. Okay, next we talk about the background of this paper. Foreign policy may be described as the goals that a country aims to achieve internationally, the principle that give rise to those goals, and the method and instruments applied to achieve them. Domestic and external forces influence a country's foreign policy. These elements are not static but can change over time, forcing a state to rethink its foreign policy in order to attain its goal. A variety of historical, geopolitical, and economic variables have affected Malaysia's foreign policy. Since its independence from the British colonial administration in 1957, the country has adopted a non-alignment policy, keeping an amiable relationship with both Western and non-Western states. Malaysia's foreign policy has been impacted by the country's ethnic and religious diversity, strategic position in Southeast Asia, and desire to maintain regional peace and economic success of peaceful relations with all nations, regardless of ideology or political system, as well as increased links with other countries in the area. Malaysia's foreign policy has undergone multiple major shifts since independence in 1957, with varying emphasis under previous premierships. Policy has been essentially driven by established national characteristics and the turnover of political leadership, in addition to the changing regional as well as international environment. Malaysia's first Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman took an anti-communist and pro-Western position at a time when Malaysia was in jeopardy by a communist insurgency. Tunku's foreign policy had to account for the internal strife between rival ideologies of democracy and communism. Under the leadership of Malaysia's second Prime Minister Tun Abdul Razak, Malaysia's foreign policy began to shift towards non-alignment and internationalism, with Malaysia joining the OIC, Organization of Islamic Conference, and the non-alignment movement now. Okay, so from 2009 until 2018, Dato Seri Najib served as the Malaysian Prime Minister, focusing on economic diplomacy and developing deeper commercial connection with other nations. His government sought to establish Malaysia as a global player to attract foreign direct investment and to diversify the country's economic ties. Dato Seri Najib introduced measures such as Economic Transformation Program (ETP) and the Government Transformation Program (GTP) to spur economic development and boost Malaysia's global competitiveness. Malaysia aggressively participate with regional organizations such as ASEAN and explored bilateral agreements to strengthen commercial relationships under Dato Seri Najib's leadership. Tun Dr. Mahathir, on the other hand, spent 2 non-consecutive terms as Malaysian Prime Minister. Tun Dr. Mahathir pushed for a self-sufficient and forceful foreign policy that prioritized Malaysian national interests throughout his first term. He advocated for less reliance on foreign forces and promote the notion of ASEAN for ASEAN. Tun Mahathir advocated for a more just global order and frequently chastised Western involvement in other nations. He was also instrumental in building ASEAN, supporting regional stability and establishing Malaysia's presence in the international world. Okay, so for the research problem in this paper is to identify and understand the key factors and motivation behind significant shift in Malaysia's foreign policy between the Najib and Mahathir eras, as well as to assess the implication of this change in Malaysia's regional global position. Secondly, to consider the consequences of Malaysia's regional and global positioning. And finally, to examine the continuity and legacy of the two eras by identifying areas of continuity or legacy in Malaysia's foreign policy that have survived the transition from Dato Seri Najib Tun Razak to Tun Mahathir. Okay, so the objective of this paper, there are 3 objectives. The first one is to identify the differences of diplomatic technique and goals in both Dato Seri Najib and Tun Mahathir Mohamad era. Secondly is to assess the impact of Malaysia's foreign policy changes on Malaysia's regional and global standing during the era of both prime ministers. Thirdly, to understand the motivation and ideological underpinnings that drove the significant shift in Malaysia's foreign policy between the two leaders in economic interests. Okay, so there are a few research questions that can be explored regarding the difference in Malaysian foreign policy in the context of Dato Seri Najib and Tun Mahathir Mohamad. Okay, so to begin, does the leadership style of Malaysia's two prime ministers influence in its foreign policy? Second question is, how did Dato Seri Najib Tun Razak and Tun Mahathir Mohamad strengthen relations between countries through Malaysia's foreign policy in their era? And lastly, what are the priorities of Dato Seri Najib and Tun Mahathir in formulating Malaysia's foreign policy? So in this research, methodology is described as the systematic way of resolving a research topic by acquiring data using various methodologies. So in this paper, we use literature review by conduct a true examination of current literature, scholarly papers, books and pertinent government documents on Malaysia foreign policy under Dato Seri Najib and Tun Mahathir. Secondly, I also use comparative analysis by compare the contrast of Malaysia's foreign policy methods outcome during the Dato Seri Najib and also Tun Mahathir Mohamad. And lastly, I use qualitative analysis by conduct a qualitative study of the obtained data to identify major terms, trends and patterns in Malaysian foreign policy during each era. Okay, so for the research scope, this paper aimed to find the difference between the policy, first of all, economic policies and trade agreement. This paper examined each Prime Minister trade policy, including free trade agreement, preferential trade deals, and economic cooperation. Examine their attempts to attract foreign direct investment (FDI) and strengthen ties with important partners and any change in trade objective and their influence on the Malaysian economy. Secondly, regional and international organization. In this scope, this paper will examine the leaders' interaction with regional organizations such as ASEAN and global organizations such as United Nations. Lastly, is bilateral relation by examining the emphasis on bilateral connection with important countries during each leader's tenure. Okay, so for the next part is the research concept or theory. So in analyzing the difference of Malaysia's foreign policy in the context of Dato Seri Najib Tun Razak and Tun Mahathir Mohamad, I use the theory of soft power. Soft power is the capacity of influence others' preference via the use of culture, values, and ideas. Soft power seeks to influence indirectly by establishing a desire for the power holder's aim, whereas hard power seeks to achieve its goal by coercion and armed force. So there are several major variations in their approaches to use soft power in the context of Malaysian foreign policy. Dato Seri Najib Razak has aimed to protect Malaysia's soft power through economic diplomacy and cultural connection. His administration highlighted moderate Islam and portrayed Malaysia as a model Muslim majority country capable of reconciling the Muslim world with the West. The government financed programs like the Global Movement of Moderates and organized International Extremist Conference. Furthermore, during Dato Sri Najib Razak leadership, Malaysia actively encouraged economic cooperation with a wide range of countries such as just bans, look its policy and attempts to recruit foreign investors. While in the Mahathir tenure, he was well known for his assertive and independent foreign policy, which was driven by a desire to protect Malaysia's national interests. He advocated for a non-alignment approach, seeking to protect Malaysia's sovereignty while remaining neutral with regard to major power blocs. Mahathir's foreign policy was regularly critical of Western powers, particularly on globalization and the negative impacts of capitalism. He also emphasized regional collaboration through institutions such as ASEAN and strove to strengthen Malaysia's place in the Muslim world. So, the significance of this study: firstly, strategic priorities in both eras. Dato Sri Najib Razak, Malaysia's Prime Minister, prioritized economic development and international investment through programs such as One Malaysia Development Berhad, One MDB project. While for Tun Mahathir Mohamad, he prioritized national sovereignty, regional stability and the expression of Malaysia's interests on the world arena. Okay, secondly is in the context of diplomatic approach, Dato Sri Najib administration followed a policy of economic diplomacy, emphasizing economic cooperation and trade connection. In contrast, Tun Mahathir's approach was motivated more by strategic concerns and a desire to safeguard Malaysia's interests. Okay, thirdly is under Dato Sri Najib, Malaysia pursued ambitious regional projects such as the development of the ASEAN Economic Community and actively engaged in regional forums. While Tun Mahathir prioritized regional cooperation within Southeast Asia and pushed for a more strong and independent attitude in international matters. Okay, so in conclusion, we can see that both Dato Sri Najib Razak and Tun Mahathir Mohamad has different approach in making the Malaysia's foreign policy. That's all from me. Thank you.